The night of August 6, 1943. Vella Gulf, Solomon Islands. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger stood in the cramped Combat Information Center aboard the destroyer USS Dunlap, watching the green glow of the newly installed SG radar screen. The air inside the compartment hung thick with humidity and tension. Outside, the waters of Vella Gulf lay black and still, bordered by the dark mass of Vella Island to starboard and Kolombangara to port. 6 American destroyers moved silently through these waters, their engines throttled back, their wakes minimal. They were hunting. At 23:33 hours, the radar operator's voice cut through the stillness. Surface contact, bearing 330, range 29,500 yards. The contact resolved into 4 distinct pips moving south through the Gulf. Moosbrugger permitted himself a slight smile. The Tokyo Express was running on schedule. In less than 15 minutes, 24 American torpedoes would be in the water. In 6 minutes after that, 3 Japanese destroyers would be on the bottom of Vella Gulf, and with them, the myth of Japanese invincibility in night surface combat would sink as well. What happened that night would mark the first time in the Pacific War that American destroyers, operating independently without cruiser support, would decisively defeat Japanese destroyers in a night torpedo action. The victory would not come from superior numbers or overwhelming firepower. It would come from something more fundamental, something that had taken the United States Navy 20 months of war to understand. The Americans had finally learned how to make their weapons work. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The tactical situation facing Moosbrugger's destroyers that night had been building for over a year. Since August of 1942, when Japanese forces had occupied Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been forced to resupply its isolated garrisons throughout the Solomon Islands, using a method that violated every principle of naval logistics. Fast warships, primarily destroyers, loaded with troops and supplies, would race down New Georgia Sound under cover of darkness, deliver their cargo, and return before daylight exposed them to American air attack. The Americans called these runs the Tokyo Express. The Japanese called them rat runs, because rats travel at night. The Tokyo Express was born of necessity and desperation. American control of Henderson Field made daylight transit impossible for slow cargo vessels. A transport making 10 knots needed approximately 18 hours to travel from Rabaul to Guadalcanal. American dive bombers and torpedo planes could find and destroy such vessels with near certainty. Destroyers, capable of 30-plus knots, could complete the same journey in darkness, arriving after sunset and departing before dawn. But destroyers were not designed as cargo carriers. Supplies had to be loaded in steel drums, lashed together, and simply pushed overboard near shore, where they might or might not be recovered. In a typical run during December of 1942, 1,500 drums were rolled into the sea. Only 300 were recovered. The remainder sank or drifted away on the current. More critically, the Tokyo Express consumed irreplaceable warships in the grinding logistics of attrition warfare. Every destroyer committed to supply runs was unavailable for fleet operations, convoy escort, or anti-submarine patrol. Japan's shipyards could not replace destroyer losses at anything approaching the rate America was commissioning new vessels. Yet, without the Tokyo Express, Japanese forces scattered across the Solomon Islands would starve. The Imperial Japanese Navy found itself caught in what one historian would later describe as fighting as uneconomical a campaign as could possibly be imagined. By August of 1943, the strategic situation had shifted decisively against Japan. The Americans had captured Henderson Field and pushed north through the Solomon Islands chain. Japanese forces now clung to Vella on Kolombangara Island, their garrison numbering 12,400 men. 3 Tokyo Express runs in late July had successfully reinforced Vella, using the same route through Vella Gulf each time. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding the destroyer Shigure, had objected to the repetition, arguing that using the same approach repeatedly was courting disaster. His concerns were overruled. The 4th run was scheduled for the night of August 6th. Captain Kaju Sugiura would lead 4 destroyers into Vella Gulf that night. His force consisted of 2 Kagero-class destroyers, Hagikaze and Arashi, and 2 Shiratsuyu-class destroyers, Kawakaze and Haras Shigure. The 4 vessels carried 950 soldiers and 50 tons of supplies. Sugiura's orders were straightforward. Proceed through Vella Gulf, offload troops and cargo at Vila, and return to base before daylight. Japanese intelligence reported no significant American naval forces in the area. The operation appeared routine, another successful Tokyo Express run to be completed before dawn. But the Americans knew the Japanese were coming. Coast watchers hidden on Kolombangara had observed Japanese preparations. Radio intercepts confirmed the timing. And this time, the Americans would not send patrol torpedo boats, which had failed disastrously in their last attempt to intercept a Tokyo Express run just 5 nights earlier. This time, Rear Admiral Theodore Wilkinson dispatched Task Group 31.2, 6 destroyers under Commander Moosbrugger's tactical command, with specific orders to intercept and destroy the Japanese force using destroyer tactics, not cruiser doctrine. For the first time in the Pacific campaign, American destroyers would be free to fight, as destroyers were meant to fight, employing their primary weapons, torpedoes, in an offensive action unencumbered by the need to protect larger ships. Moosbrugger had divided his 6 destroyers into 2 divisions. Division A1, consisting of Dunlap, Craven, and Maury, would carry out the torpedo attack. Division A2, consisting of Lang, Sterrett, and Stack under Commander Roger Simpson, had replaced some of their torpedo tubes with additional 40mm anti-aircraft guns, and would provide covering fire and engage any targets that survived the initial torpedo salvo. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Division A1 would fire torpedoes, then turn away sharply to avoid any Japanese torpedo response. Division A2 would cross the Japanese formation from a different angle, ready to launch their own torpedoes if the Japanese attempted to turn into Division A1's attack. If barges accompanied the destroyers, Division A2's extra guns would engage them. On the morning of August 6th, Moosbrugger convened a conference of his 6 destroyer captains aboard Dunlap at Purvis Bay near Guadalcanal. He reviewed the operation in meticulous detail, ensuring that every commanding officer understood the plan and could execute it independently if communications failed during the night action. Moosbrugger believed, as he later wrote in his action report, that mutual understanding between commanders and commanding officers was requisite to complete and coordinated destruction of the enemy. The conference lasted several hours. By the time it concluded, each captain knew precisely what Moosbrugger intended and what his own ship would do in any contingency. That afternoon, Task Group 31.2 departed Purvis Bay and headed north. The destroyers transited south of New Georgia Island and entered Vella Gulf through Gizo Strait, a poorly charted passage requiring careful navigation. By 2200 hours, they were in position in the southern end of Vella Gulf. They turned north and began their sweep up the Gulf, 2 columns separated by 4,000 yards, probing with radar, silent and unseen. For Moosbrugger's crew, the operation represented something more than another night patrol. They were finally being given the opportunity to fight the way they had trained, to use their weapons offensively rather than defensively, to act rather than react. The frustration of months spent escorting larger ships while watching Japanese destroyers operate with impunity had been considerable. Destroyer crews believed their ships were being misused, held back from employing their speed, maneuverability, and torpedo firepower effectively. Now, for one night at least, the destroyers would show what they could do when given the freedom to fight. The crucial difference that night, the advantage that made everything else possible, was not the number of American ships or the skill of their commanders, though both factors mattered. The crucial difference was that the Americans possessed working radar and, for the first time in the Pacific War, working torpedoes. These 2 technological advantages, properly exploited, would transform the nature of naval warfare in the Solomon Islands and doom the Tokyo Express. American radar technology, in August of 1943, represented a decisive but recently acquired advantage. The SG surface search radar operating on centimetric wavelength, could detect surface targets at ranges exceeding 20 nautical miles and could differentiate between ships and land masses with reasonable accuracy. Japanese destroyers in 1943 carried radar sets that were primitive by comparison, often unable to distinguish ship contacts from islands. This technological disparity meant that American destroyers could detect Japanese forces first, maneuver into advantageous positions undetected, and launch torpedo attacks before the enemy knew they were present. But radar alone would not have been sufficient to ensure victory at Vella Gulf. For 20 months, American destroyers and submarines had possessed radar advantages in various engagements, but had failed to achieve decisive results because their primary offensive weapon, the torpedo, did not work reliably. The story of American torpedo failure during the first 2 years of the Pacific War stands as one of the most significant technical and institutional failures in United States military history. The Mark 15 torpedo, standard weapon of American destroyers, and its submarine counterpart, the Mark 14, went to war in December of 1941 with 3 critical defects. First, the torpedoes ran approximately 10 feet deeper than their set depth, causing them to pass harmlessly beneath their targets. Second, the magnetic influence exploder, designed to detonate the warhead beneath a ship's keel by sensing changes in the Earth's magnetic field, was hypersensitive and would detonate prematurely or would fail to detonate at all. Third, the contact exploder, intended as a backup if the magnetic exploder failed, used a firing pin that would bend or shatter on impact with a target's hull, preventing detonation. These defects should have been discovered during peacetime testing. They were not, for several reasons that reveal profound institutional failures in American weapons development. The magnetic exploder had been tested exactly twice before being approved for fleet use in 1934. In one of those tests, it failed. No further testing was conducted. The exploder had been designed and tested in the magnetic latitudes of Newport, Rhode Island, and had never been tested in equatorial or southern magnetic latitudes, where American submarines and destroyers would actually fight. The depth-keeping problem had been masked during testing because exercise torpedoes used water-filled practice heads that were lighter than warheads filled with explosives. The contact exploder had worked adequately on earlier, slower torpedoes, but the Mark 14 and Mark 15 were faster, and the increased impact force caused the firing pins to fail. No one had tested the mechanism at combat impact speeds. Perhaps most damaging, the torpedoes were expensive, approximately $10,000 to $15,000 per unit, an enormous sum during the Depression years when the weapons were developed. The Bureau of Ordnance, unwilling to expend scarce funds on live-fire testing with actual warheads, had conducted most tests using inert practice heads. The few tests conducted with live warheads had used old submarines as targets, towed to the firing range and anchored. These tests did not replicate combat conditions, where torpedoes would strike moving targets at various angles and speeds. Operational commanders began reporting torpedo problems within weeks of the war's start. Submarine captains filed action reports describing hits that did not detonate, premature explosions, and torpedoes that ran beneath targets without exploding. The Bureau of Ordnance dismissed these reports. Bureau personnel insisted the torpedoes were functioning properly and that problems lay with bad approaches, poor maintenance, or operator error by submarine and destroyer crews. This bureaucratic intransigence would persist for 20 months, costing American forces countless sunk ships and merchant vessels that escaped because American torpedoes failed to work. The depth problem was identified and partially corrected in mid-1942, when submarine commanders began setting torpedoes to run at shallower depths than calculated for their targets. But this workaround only made the other problems more apparent. With torpedoes now running at correct depths and actually hitting targets, the magnetic exploder's failures became undeniable. Some torpedoes exploded prematurely, detonating 20 to 50 yards short of the target. Others ran directly under targets, without exploding. Still, others struck targets squarely and failed to detonate because the contact exploder's firing pin bent or shattered on impact. By early 1943, the torpedo problem had created a crisis of morale in the submarine force and among destroyer crews. Men were risking their lives, maneuvering into attack positions, achieving hits, and watching their torpedoes fail. Japanese ships sailed on unharmed, while American warheads malfunctioned. Submarine commanders began deactivating the magnetic exploders on their own initiative, contrary to Bureau of Ordnance directives. Some were reprimanded for this unauthorized modification. Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarines Pacific, and Admiral Thomas Kincaid, Commander Allied Naval Forces Southwest Pacific, finally forced the issue. In June of 1943, over the strenuous objections of the Bureau of Ordnance, Admiral Chester Nimitz ordered the magnetic influence feature of the Mark VI exploder deactivated throughout the Pacific Fleet. Rear Admiral Ralph Christie, who had invented the magnetic exploder, lamented in his diary, "Today, the long, hard battle on the Mark VI magnetic feature ends with defeat. I am forced to inactivate all magnetic exploders. We are licked." But deactivating the magnetic exploder only revealed the third problem. With contact exploders now being relied upon exclusively, the firing pin failures became catastrophic. Submarine and destroyer crews watched torpedoes strike targets squarely, heard the sharp crack of impact, saw fragments of the torpedo body rupture, but witnessed no explosion. The warheads would not detonate. Through July and early August of 1943, intensive testing at Pearl Harbor and Newport finally identified the firing pin problem and developed a solution. Lighter-weight aluminum alloy firing pins, milled from Japanese aircraft propeller blades, recovered after the Pearl Harbor attack, proved strong enough to withstand impact without bending. New contact exploders incorporating electronic detonators rather than mechanical firing pins began reaching the fleet in September of 1943. For Moosbrugger's destroyers entering Vella Gulf on the night of August 6th, the timing was critical. Their torpedoes had finally been fixed. The magnetic exploders had been deactivated. The contact exploders had been upgraded with the new firing pin assemblies. For the first time in the war, American destroyers could expect their torpedoes to run at correct depth, travel straight to their targets, and detonate reliably on impact. Combined with radar that gave them the advantage of first detection, Moosbrugger's destroyers possessed weapons that would actually work. The tactical doctrine Moosbrugger would employ that night had been developed by Commodore Arleigh Burke following intensive analysis of earlier night surface actions in the Solomons. Burke had recognized that American forces were misusing their advantages. In earlier engagements, cruiser-destroyer forces had fought in long columns designed to maximize gunfire effectiveness. This formation made them vulnerable to Japanese long-lance torpedoes, which had longer range, faster speed, and more reliable warheads than American weapons. Burke developed tactics that exploited American radar advantages to achieve surprise, using short columns that could deliver sudden torpedo attacks and then maneuver away before the enemy could respond. Moosbrugger had served under Burke and had studied these tactics carefully. His battle plan for Vella Gulf incorporated Burke's principles completely. The American destroyers would detect the Japanese first using radar. They would maneuver into ideal torpedo attack position without being seen. They would fire their torpedoes and immediately turn away, avoiding any Japanese torpedo response. They would open gunfire only after their torpedoes struck, using muzzle flashes to illuminate and destroy any surviving Japanese vessels. The entire engagement would be over in minutes, decided by the initial torpedo salvo before the Japanese could react effectively. The psychological dimension of the coming battle was equally important. Japanese destroyer crews had never been defeated in a night torpedo action. Their confidence was absolute. They possessed the long-lance torpedo, superior in range and warhead to any weapon the Americans possessed. Their crews were trained in night operations to a degree American sailors could not match. Their lookouts could detect targets at distances that seemed impossible to American observers. Time and again, Japanese destroyer forces had achieved tactical surprise, launched devastating torpedo attacks, and withdrawn before American forces could respond. The Tokyo Express had become routine precisely because it succeeded repeatedly. American destroyer crews, by contrast, carried the psychological burden of repeated failure. They had watched Japanese forces operate with impunity. They had fired torpedoes that malfunctioned. They had seen cruisers sunk, destroyers damaged, and operations fail because American weapons did not work and Japanese weapons worked with lethal efficiency. The morale crisis in the destroyer force was profound. Men were dying because their equipment failed, and institutional inertia prevented the problems from being acknowledged and fixed. But by August of 1943, the technical problems had been solved. The torpedoes would work. The radar gave decisive advantage, and Moosbrugger's tactical plan would exploit both advantages completely. The coming engagement would test whether American destroyers, finally equipped with functioning weapons and freed from the doctrinal constraints of cruiser escort duty, could defeat Japanese destroyers in the type of night surface action the Japanese had dominated for 2 years. Everything that would happen in the next hour would hinge on whether the new American tactics, the new American technology, and the corrected American torpedoes could overcome Japanese experience, Japanese confidence, and Japanese skill. At 23:33 hours, the test began. The radar contact at 23:33 hours placed the Japanese force at 29,500 yards, approximately 14 nautical miles distant. The 4 Japanese destroyers were proceeding south through Vella Gulf at approximately 20 knots, their formation loose, their attention focused on the approaches to Villa rather than on potential threats from the south. Captain Sugiura's Shigure, carrying no troops, lagged 1,500 yards behind the 3 transport destroyers. Captain Hara, commanding Shigure, had trained his torpedo tubes to port, toward Vella La Vella, where intelligence reported no American forces. The starboard side, facing Kolombangara, appeared clear of ships on Japanese radar sets, which could not distinguish between American destroyers hugging the island's shore and the island itself. Moosbrugger's division, a 1, in the left column closest to Kolombangara, held the ideal position. The American destroyers were silhouetted against the dark mass of the island, invisible to Japanese lookouts scanning open water. The Japanese destroyers, by contrast, were profiled against the lighter western sky and the open waters of Vella Gulf. At 23:36 hours, Craven confirmed the radar contact. 4 distinct targets, proceeding south in column formation, range closing rapidly. Moosbrugger ordered Division A1 to prepare torpedoes for firing. Division A2, in the right column, began a wide turn to starboard, maneuvering to cross behind Division A1's track and position themselves to cross the Japanese formation's course from a different angle. The tactical geometry was textbook perfect. Division A1 would fire torpedoes from the Japanese force's starboard beam at a range of approximately 5,000 yards. The torpedoes would cover that distance in approximately 2.5 minutes at 46 knots. Division A2 would be positioned to cross the Japanese formation's T, placing themselves perpendicular to the enemy's course, able to fire torpedoes that would strike any ship that attempted to turn toward Division A1. If the Japanese turned away from Division A1's torpedoes, they would expose their broadsides to Division A2. The 2 American divisions had created a geometry of destruction from which there was no escape. At 23:41 hours, with range closed to 4,800 yards, Moosbrugger gave the order. Dunlap fired 8 Mark 15 torpedoes. Craven fired 8. Maury fired 8. 24 torpedoes entered the water in rapid succession, set to run at 6 feet depth, speed 46 knots, spreading to cover the Japanese formation. The 3 American destroyers immediately turned 90 degrees to starboard, increasing speed, opening the range, creating separation between themselves and any Japanese torpedo response. The maneuver was executed with precision. Division A1 disappeared into the darkness before the Japanese could respond. The 24 torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal through the dark waters of Vella Gulf. For once, American torpedoes functioned exactly as designed. No magnetic exploders detonated prematurely. No depth-keeping failures sent weapons passing harmlessly beneath targets. No contact exploders malfunctioned. The weapons behaved as their designers had intended, but as they had failed to do for 20 months of war. Each torpedo carried a 663-pound Torpex warhead, more powerful than TNT, capable of breaking a destroyer's keel with a single hit. The Japanese ships had no warning. Their radar showed nothing. Their lookouts saw nothing until the final seconds. At 23:43 hours, lookouts aboard Shigure spotted the American destroyers, but only after the torpedoes were already in the water and Division A1 had begun its turn away. Sugiura's force had been caught completely by surprise, in column formation, unable to maneuver effectively, presenting their vulnerable broadsides to the incoming torpedo spread. The first torpedoes struck at 23:46 hours. Multiple explosions erupted almost simultaneously along the Japanese column. Hajikaze, leading the formation, was hit amidships by at least 2 torpedoes. The detonations broke her back. Flames erupted from ruptured fuel tanks, illuminating the entire formation. Arashi, second in line, took at least 1 torpedo that detonated beneath her forward magazine. The explosion was catastrophic, sending a pillar of flame hundreds of feet into the night sky. Kawakaze, third in the column, was struck by at least 1 torpedo. She burst into flames immediately, her entire midship section ablaze. Shigure, trailing behind and slightly to port, was also struck. 1 torpedo passed through her rudder without detonating, a dud that should have destroyed her but instead only damaged her steering. It was the only torpedo failure of the night, and it saved Hara's ship. Shigure, unable to steer effectively but still able to move, turned hard to port and accelerated, attempting to escape into the darkness. The 3 leading Japanese destroyers were finished. All 3 were ablaze, their crews abandoning ship, their ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. But Moosbrugger was not finished. At 23:49 hours, Division A2, having completed their turn and crossed ahead of the Japanese formation, opened fire with their 5-inch guns. Lang, Sterrett, and Stack poured gunfire into the burning Japanese vessels at ranges below 4,000 yards. The Japanese ships, already destroyed by torpedo hits, were now torn apart by high-explosive shells. Hagikaze sank first, disappearing beneath the surface within minutes. Arashi followed moments later, her magazine detonating in a final explosion that sent debris hundreds of yards in all directions. Kawakaze, burning furiously, capsized and sank at 23:56 hours. Division A1 turned back toward the scene of destruction, their guns also opening fire, engaging what remained of the Japanese force. A Japanese destroyer, visible by the light of the burning ships, returned fire briefly. This was Kawakaze in her death throes, her crew fighting to the last moment. Division A2's guns concentrated on her, and she literally torn to pieces, in Moosbrugger's later words, before disappearing beneath the waves. At 00:03 hours, Moosbrugger ordered both divisions to cease fire and reform. The engagement was over. The entire action, from first radar contact to final shots, had lasted 30 minutes. The decisive phase, from torpedo launch to the destruction of 3 Japanese destroyers, had consumed 6 minutes. In that brief span, Moosbrugger's force had accomplished what 15 PT boats armed with 60 torpedoes had failed to do 5 nights earlier. They had destroyed a Tokyo Express run completely, sinking 3 destroyers and killing over 1,200 Japanese soldiers and sailors. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The waters of Vella Gulf burned. Fuel oil spread across the surface, ignited by fires from the sinking destroyers, creating patches of flame that illuminated the scene with hellish light. Debris floated everywhere. Life rafts, wooden planks, steel fragments, personal equipment, and hundreds of men struggling in the water. Some swam toward Vella La Vella, the nearest land, approximately 4 miles distant. Others clung to wreckage, calling out in the darkness. Many simply floated, unconscious or dead from blast injuries, burns, or drowning. The American destroyers approached the burning area cautiously. Japanese survivors might include officers with intelligence value. Rescue attempts might save lives. But the rescue efforts would prove almost futile. not because the Americans refused to try, but because the Japanese refused to be rescued. When American destroyers maneuvered close to survivors and threw life rings and lines into the water, the men in the water pushed them away. Some shouted defiance. Others simply swam away from the approaching American ships. A handful of wounded men, too injured to resist, were pulled aboard. The rest refused rescue. This phenomenon was not unique to Vella Gulf. Japanese military culture, shaped by Bushido traditions and intensified by wartime propaganda, taught soldiers and sailors that surrender was disgrace worse than death. Captured personnel brought shame upon their families, their units, and their nation. Death in combat was honorable. Capture was not. Men trained under this doctrine, facing the choice between rescue by the enemy and drowning in darkness, chose drowning. They chose death over the unbearable shame of survival as prisoners. The psychological dimension of this choice reveals the gulf that separated Japanese and American understanding of warfare. American military culture, while emphasizing courage and determination, did not teach that surrender under impossible circumstances was shameful. Captured American personnel were considered casualties, not disgraceful failures. They were expected to give only name, rank, and serial number, then await liberation or repatriation. The concept that honorable men should choose death over capture was alien to American thinking, but to Japanese personnel, the choice was obvious. Death was preferable to shame. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding Shigure as she fled north through Vella Gulf, grasped immediately what had happened. The Americans had achieved complete surprise. Their radar had detected the Japanese force before Japanese lookouts saw anything. Their torpedoes, which had been notoriously unreliable earlier in the war, had functioned perfectly. Their tactics had been flawless. Hara later wrote that the American marksmanship was phenomenal. Never before had he seen such accuracy by the enemy. The torpedo hits on Arashi and Kawakaze were textbook perfect, striking precisely where maximum damage would occur. Shigure fired 8 torpedoes as she retreated, hoping to slow American pursuit or score a lucky hit. All 8 missed. Hara's ship, her rudder damaged, steered erratically through the darkness, expecting at any moment to be illuminated by American searchlights or struck by American torpedoes. Neither happened. The American destroyers did not pursue. They remained in the battle area, conducting rescue operations and ensuring no Japanese vessels survived. Shigure escaped, the sole survivor of the 4-ship force that had entered Vella Gulf that night. By 0100 hours, the waters had quieted. The fires burned lower as fuel was consumed. Moosbrugger ordered his force to proceed north to the entrance of Vella Gulf, positioning to intercept any additional Japanese forces that might approach. None came. At 0300 hours, satisfied that no further threats existed, Moosbrugger ordered his destroyers to depart Vella Gulf and return to base. The 6 American ships had not suffered so much as a single enemy hit. The only American casualty was a sailor aboard one of the destroyers who had suffered a crush injury when a gun loading mechanism accidentally caught his hand. Not a single bullet or shell fragment from Japanese guns had struck any American vessel. In the months following Vella Gulf, American destroyer forces would win repeatedly, using the tactics proven in that battle. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, in November of 1943, saw American destroyers achieve surprise and deliver devastating torpedo attacks. The Battle of Cape Street, George, also in November, resulted in another decisive American victory with 3 Japanese destroyers sunk and no American losses. The Battle of Surigao Strait in October of 1944 would see American destroyers and PT boats execute coordinated torpedo attacks that contributed to the annihilation of a Japanese battleship force. Each of these victories traced its doctrinal lineage directly to Vella Gulf. The pattern was established on that night in August: achieve surprise through radar, deliver coordinated torpedo attacks before the enemy can respond, maneuver aggressively to avoid enemy torpedoes, exploit the chaos created by the initial attack with gunfire. The tactics worked because the technology worked, and the technology worked because the institutional barriers to fixing it had finally been overcome. The night of August 6, 1943, in Vella Gulf, marked the moment when American technological and tactical superiority achieved decisive expression. The 6 minutes that destroyed 3 Japanese destroyers demonstrated that American forces had finally solved the problems that had plagued them since Pearl Harbor. Their weapons worked, their tactics were sound. Their execution was professional. The institutional barriers that had prevented problems from being acknowledged and fixed had been overcome. What followed was not just a series of tactical victories, but a systematic campaign that would lead inexorably to Japanese defeat. 70 years after the battle, when naval historians analyze the Pacific War's turning points, Vella Gulf appears as a hinge moment, less dramatic than Midway but equally significant in its implications. It marked the end of Japanese confidence in night surface combat superiority. It validated American destroyer tactics that would dominate for the remainder of the war. It demonstrated that technological problems, once properly addressed, could produce decisive advantages. And it proved that institutional resistance to change, however entrenched, could be overcome when operational necessity and undeniable evidence combined to force correction. The Tokyo Express began its final runs in the months following Vella Gulf, but it was a shadow of what it had been. Smaller forces, more cautious approaches, higher loss rates, and lower delivery rates characterized operations through late 1943. By early 1944, even these scaled-back runs had ceased. The slot, which had seen so much night combat, was now firmly under American control. Japanese destroyers that had once raced down those waters with near impunity now avoided them entirely. The strategic initiative had shifted completely and irreversibly. On the morning of August 7, 1943, when Moosbrugger's 6 destroyers returned to base with their crews intact and their ships undamaged, they brought more than news of a tactical victory. They brought proof that American naval forces had achieved the competence necessary to win the Pacific War. The problems were solved, the weapons worked, the tactics succeeded. Everything that followed, from the liberation of the Philippines to the final campaigns against the Japanese home islands, became possible because of lessons learned and applied in battles like Vella Gulf. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger stood in Dunlap's Combat Information Center that night and watched his battle plan unfold with precision. 24 torpedoes in the water, 6 minutes to impact. 3 Japanese destroyers destroyed, 0 American losses. It was the kind of victory that changes wars, not through its scale, but through what it proves. American destroyers could win. American weapons could work. American tactics could succeed. The Japanese could be beaten decisively in the type of engagement they had dominated for 2 years. The sign that might have hung in Moosbrugger's planning spaces would have read differently than the one Jimmy Doolittle ordered changed in England months earlier. It would have said, "The first duty of destroyers is to destroy enemy destroyers." Everything else followed from that principle. At Vella Gulf, on a dark night in August, American destroyers fulfilled that duty completely. The 6 minutes that destroyed the Tokyo Express ensured that American forces would control the Solomons, that Japanese garrisons would be isolated and defeated, and that the long campaign across the Pacific could continue toward its inevitable conclusion. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.